So I read both of John Michael Greer's UFO books recently. That first one, which was published in 2009, is the UFO Phenomenon, Fact, Fantasy, and Disinformation. The second is the UFO Chronicles, how science fiction, shamanistic experiences, and secret Air Force projects created the UFO myth. Pretty long title, that is. I want to make this clear, though, before I get into it. The second book really is an updated version of the first. It's when you're buying them, it's not necessarily clear if that's the case. And if you look on the cover, as I bought the earlier one in an actual I don't know, new age kind of like alternative bookstore, and then I saw the second one actually at a Barnes and Nobles, but ended up ordering it online after I read the first one. You can't really tell that the second book is an updated version of the first one, either if you order it online or if you buy it IRL. So that's kind of sad. I don't know. I don't think it's intentionally made to make you buy both of them there. Um, but I got them both because I thought that they might be different. I didn't know. I don't know if I want to say if the second version is superior, though. It has more details about declassified U.S. Air Force and military intelligence stuff, but the first one has footnotes, and the second one just kind of has a reference page. And the first one doesn't really have any big overarching things that the second one is missing. So I'd say, you know, if you can get either of them, if you get the first one cheaper, even though it's older, it's not necessarily paying more to get the second edition. I don't think it's worth it. Anyway, the book itself is probably one of the best books ever written, which is skeptical on the subject of UFOs. And there are a few reasons for that. But the most important is that it's sympathetic. Greer touches on this repeatedly throughout the book itself and throughout other books where he's touched on the subject of the paranormal and folklore. Professional debunkers are essentially smug, rude assholes, and this makes them pretty unlikable. The paranormal researcher, on the other hand, even if he's stretching the truth or even making stuff out of whole cloth, is a lot more sympathetic a person. When someone sees something that they should not, they're often very, very startled and disturbed by that, and they don't want to share it. The more sympathetic approach of the paranormal researcher, listening to them and going out of their way to hear their story, that's going to make a bigger impact upon the witness of something weird. So if somebody sees an ape-man in the woods, let's think about this. Is it more helpful to say, oh, okay, don't worry, it's all right. Many people say this, you're not crazy. Or is it more helpful to say, it was just a bear, dumbass, you're a liar? And then proceed to slander them and call them a liar, take their blurry photograph, debunk it. Quite obviously, I think that the answer is the former rather than the latter. Basically, people, when they see UFOs or they see ghosts or they see ape men or they see whatever strange thing that ought not be according to modern science, right? They're actually really afraid and shameful to speak out about what they saw. Whether or not what they saw or what their brain interpreted what they saw is an actual flying saucer from outer space or an actual missing link creature or so on is of less importance. Rather, the real importance is how you approach these people. If these debunkers are approaching these people, calling them liars, shaming them in front of the mass media, debunkers are at a losing battle. Another thing that makes Greer a much better and more balanced skeptic is that he accepts that most, if not the majority, of cases will never be explained. He makes suggestions, but ultimately he acknowledges that weird things happen that we don't understand. It's important to contrast that again with your typical debunker skeptic who creates ad hoc explanations for everything regardless of what that phenomenon is. Say if somebody saw a metallic football that was like 40 feet wide just floating above their head, 20, 30 feet above their head, this debunker is just going to pull out of his ass, "It was Venus," right? Giving such an incredulous explanation undermines the skeptic and his approach more than saying, "I just don't know." When skeptics give their harebrained, ad hoc explanations, this causes people to be more sympathetic to the original person's testimony. In such a case, a skeptic is shooting themselves in the foot because they are making such an improbable explanation. They are effectively framing that debate into an either or, whether it's either Venus or the person actually saw a giant floating metallic football. And in doing that, they're really obscuring that in the first place, eyewitness testimony is one of the weakest forms of evidence. It doesn't really hold water. If somebody says, "I saw a gnome running out of my kitchen," what am I going to do? I mean, if somebody said that to me in real life, I'll just be like, "That's nice, honey," and move on. But by skeptics trying to debunk that gnome or trying to debunk that metallic football, they're making an either or. And that dynamic ends up giving more credibility to the person who has no evidence that was just the eyewitness. Finally, Greer is pretty widely read on the subject and talks at length in regards to alternative explanations to the UFO phenomenon beyond whether or not it's just Venus, dumbass, or they're nut and bolt spaceships from another world and they're completely physical. He touches on numerous theories on the origins of UFOs, from natural and rational, such as tectonic earth lights or ball lightning, to the very absurd, such as Nazis from Aldebaran and giant space amoebas. Most importantly, he touches on the more esoteric theories promoted by Jacques Vallée and John Keel and others. If you agree or not with their esoteric answers to the UFO question, they really are some of the most important commentators on the subject, as they draw very important parallels between the UFO phenomenon and traditional folklore. Greer does think that earth lights and ball lightning are natural phenomenon which can best explain a large portion of UFO phenomenon and sightings. He notes that because of the scientific heresy that surrounds people that see UFOs, any explanation or research into these explanations and topics is just kind of dumped over and abandoned because they're unfairly tinged with flying saucer technology, whether or not they're real. And I think clearly both earth lights and ball lightning are things that are real that we must research. Like I said earlier, by excluding these explanations from legitimate research, it only makes belief in nuts and bolts visitors stronger. Essentially, Greer's hypothesis is that people are conditioned to interpret unexplained phenomenon in the sky based on their own cultural biases. And there has been major cultural factors which have shaped our view of UFOs top down to make us believe that they're visitors from another world. He begins by stating that there have always been sightings of unexplained objects in the sky throughout all of human history. It should be noted, though, that the UFO phenomenon usually is bunched together beginning in the second half of the 20th century with the Kenneth Arnold sightings. And that began a significant uptick in the number of sightings of unexplained objects in the sky. That reasoning for this uptick is that there are now human-piloted objects in the sky along with human-created satellites. The U.S. military has used this as cover for its secret advanced aircraft such as the U-2, the Blackbird, spy balloons, and its various stealth aircraft. And basically, the U.S. government plays off sightings of these strange aircraft and their experiments as UFOs. Many of these objects move at such a high altitude that they can cause optical effects which cause them not to look like a normal aircraft or a satellite, but into something else entirely. A good example is originally the U-2 spy plane, which flew extremely high, was painted silver, which causes it to reflect sunlight and kind of look like this very distant fireball. Most often a strange light. The United States and to some extent the Soviets would not acknowledge the existence of these aircraft and leave public opinion open to speculate. Furthermore, there is anecdotal cases in which it's been revealed UFO researchers were fed false information by the US government to further obscure its, latest high-tech aircraft and space technology. This created a smokescreen which obscured that secret technology from the Soviets and any other country. It should be noted that many of the most prominent UFO researchers as well, from Hayek to Cooper, had connections with the military in some form or another. Secondly, while revealing information about UFOs seen in the Air Force is illegal, very few people, if any, have ever been prosecuted for sharing what they saw in the military in regards to UFOs. At the same time, there is this uptick in sightings where there are two major cultural factors which are shaping public perception towards the idea of these unexplained objects in the sky being piloted by visitors from outer space. First, you got the science fiction genre, and then second, you have the occult. The science fiction genre came into prominence during the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century as one of the most prominent literary genres in the English language and then later throughout the world. It should be noted that nearly every major conspiracy or trend within the UFO subculture is preempted by some kind of prior science fiction media. While Barney and Betty Hill abduction existed before it was a television docudrama, The Uninterrupted Journey, when it was released, The Uninterrupted Journey was correlated with a direct massive jump in the amount of people who started reporting alien abductions. Likewise, David Icke's reptilian hypothesis was of course detailed extensively prior to David Icke coming out with it by the television show V and the movie They Live. And the ultimate example being the writings of Richard Sharp Shaver, who was a pulp writer in the 1940s. He basically preempted the entire UFO frenzy with his pulp stories. When it comes to the occult, it bears remembering that the contactee movement, or, you want to put it bluntly, the religious side of the UFO movement, where people are being contacted from beings in other planets and visiting their worlds, predates UFOs entirely. Entering into the public framework is something we widely think about. In the initial decades of the UFO movement or phenomenon's popularity within the wider popular culture, the contactee movement made up the majority of believers in alien spacecraft visiting the Earth. And you know what? It probably does to this day. With many new religious movements such as Raelians coming out of the contactees, these religions even have their category of their own, UFO religion. As such, the idea that visitors from other worlds here on Earth has broken free from contactees, though, and entered into the wider popular culture. But the origin point for the idea of flying saucers and spacecraft with visitors from another world really starts there in the contactee movement. And even outside of the contactee movement and the UFO religions in general, many key elements of the New Age movement have permeated through the contactees into the wider UFO subculture. Greer does not exclude or dismiss high strangeness sightings. Rather, he's deeply sympathetic to them, and places, though, them within the context of shamanistic visions. For the person who sees this sort of thing, they perceive them as real, and they're clearly not lying. They are not suffering from a delusion caused by mental illness. Rather, it is natural for humans to see things that are not physically there, and that does not mean that they have schizophrenia or any similar illnesses. They are in fact seeing things which hold significant religious and cultural importance within their own culture. and they're forming a pretty big societal function in doing so. These people often become mystics, saints, shamans, and witch doctors in their respective cultures. And in doing so, they act in a group evolutionary pattern where they reinforce the group identity and make it stronger. It does help explain away high strangeness in a way which puts it in a pretty materialist context, though. And it allows the seriousness and I guess the more undebunkable nature of those sightings into a strong context for his overall message in his book. In general, it's a pretty short book at about 200 pages, and it gives pretty cohesive and significant explanation for the UFO phenomenon and a pretty good outline of a basic history of that phenomenon. And I went through what he says there. That doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with him, and whether or not you agree with his conclusions is another thing. Regardless, it's a very well-written book and very well-thought-out book, which should be amongst the reading for material for any serious student of the UFO phenomenon and its history.